how people lock their doors before modern locks, and more. Good evening. Welcome back. Tonight, we're going to explore something very ordinary, something so simple and repetitive that it barely deserves attention. We're to talk about doors. Not the grand doors of castles or the carved doors of cathedrals, but the everyday doors of ordinary homes. And more specifically, we're going to talk about how people kept those doors closed when there were no keys, no locks, no complicated mechanisms to turn or click into place. This is not a story about danger. There will be no dramatic sieges, no tales of thieves in the night, no narrow escapes. This is a story about routine, about the quiet, mundane habits of people who lived hundreds or thousands of years ago. People who closed their doors at the end of the day, placed a beam across the opening, tied a rope, or simply trusted that no one would enter. It is a story about the small, forgettable moments that filled the space between waking and sleeping, between outside and inside. As always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you're settling into bed, winding down from a long day, or simply letting your mind drift away from the noise of modern life, I am glad you are here. Now let us begin. When doors were just openings. In the beginning, there were no doors at all. There were openings. Holes in walls, gaps in stone, places where the outside ended and the inside began, but nothing solid to mark the boundary. The earliest humans who built shelters, who stacked stones or wove branches into walls, did not think immediately of creating a barrier that could swing open and closed. They thought of cover. They thought of a roof. They thought of walls to block the wind. The opening was simply what remained when the walls went up. For thousands of years, this was enough. In small communities where every person knew every other person, with a population of an entire settlement might number fewer than 50 souls, there was little need to physically block the entrance to a dwelling. If you want to keep someone out, you simply stayed near the door. If you needed to leave, you trusted that your neighbors would not enter. This was not naivety. This was practicality. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, where a poor harvest meant that everyone suffered and a good hunt meant that everyone ate, the social bond between people was stronger than any wooden plank. Privacy, in the way we understand it today, was not a priority. The concept of a private space, a room that belonged entirely to one person or one family, was foreign to these early communities. Homes were often single-room structures. Everyone slept in the same space. Everyone ate in the same space. The fire that cooked the food also heated the room and provided a light by which people worked after the sun went down. The door, or rather the doorway, was not there to keep secrets or guard possessions. It was there to keep out the cold, the rain, and the animals that wandered at night. Some of the earliest door coverings were not solid at all. They were pieces of animal hide, heavy leather, or thick fabric, hung across the opening and weighted at the bottom with stones or wooden pegs. These coverings swayed in the breeze. They could be pushed aside with one hand. They provided no real security, only a suggestion of separation. But again, security was not the point. The point was to block the wind. The point was to keep the warmth of the fire inside during the winter months. In warmer climates, some homes had no door coverings at all. The opening remained open. Air flowed freely through the dwelling, cooling the interior during the hottest part of the day. In these places, the threat of cold was not a concern. The threat of rain was seasonal, and the threat of intruders was managed not by doors, but by community vigilance. People knew who belonged and who did not. Strangers were noticed immediately. Woven mats made from reeds or grasses were also common. These mats could be rolled up during the day and lowered at night. They were light and easy to manipulate, and they cost nothing to make beyond the time spent gathering the materials and weaving them together. In ancient Egypt, where papyrus grew abundantly along the banks of the Nile, these mats were ubiquitous. They hung in doorways. They covered windows. They divided one section of a dwelling from another. When the family went to sleep, the mat was lowered. When they woke, it was rolled up again and tied to the frame with a simple strip of leather or a length of cord. The act of lowering the mat was a ritual. It marked the transition from day to night, from the public world outside to the private world inside. It was not a lock. It was a signal. It told anyone who approached that the family was no longer receiving visitors, that the day's work was done, and that it was time to rest. Wooden planks eventually replaced fabric and hide in many regions. But even these early wooden doors were not secure with locks. They were simply heavy pieces of wood that could be propped against the opening or hung from leather hinges. To close the door, you pulled it shut. To open it, you pushed it aside. There was no mechanism to engage, no bolt to slide into place. The door itself was the barrier, and its weight alone was enough to keep it from swinging open in the wind. This simplicity defined the earliest relationship between humans and their doors. The door was not a puzzle to be solved, not a challenge to overcome. It was a piece of the house, no more complicated than the walls or the roof. It stood in the opening when it needed to stand, and it moved aside when it needed to move. And at night, when the family settled into sleep, the door was pulled close, and someone, perhaps the eldest member of the household, perhaps the strongest, would place something heavy against it. A stone, a basket filled with grain, anything with enough weight to keep the door from swinging inward if an animal pressed against it. And that was enough. That was all that was needed. Simple wooden bars and beams. Somewhere at some point in time, someone looked at a door and thought, what if I could hold this closed from the inside, even when I am not standing next to it? What if I could go to sleep without worrying that the wind would push it open, or that an animal would wander in during the night? The answer was astonishingly simple. A wooden bar, a beam, a single piece of wood, thick and heavy, laid horizontally across the door. This was the birth of the door security that would dominate human life for thousands of years. It required no special knowledge, no rare materials, no complex craftsmanship. It required only a tree, an axe, and a doorway with brackets on either side to hold the bar in place. The wooden bar was usually as wide as the door itself, sometimes even wider. It rested in two slots, one carved into the wall, on either side of the door frame. These slots were called drawbar slots, and they were deep enough to hold the bar securely, but shallow enough that the bar could be lifted out when needed. The bar itself was often round, shaped like a log. Those who were squared off were easier handling. The wood was dense and heavy. Oak was preferred in Europe, cedar or sycamore in the Middle East. Whatever hardwood was available and could be cut to size. To secure the door, you took the bar, which might be resting against the wall or leaning the corner during the day, and you lifted it. If you were strong enough, you lifted it with both hands. If the bar was particularly heavy, you might drag one end across the floor, tilting it upward until you could slide it into the first bracket. Then you lifted the other end, balancing the weight, and slid it into the second bracket. The bar dropped into place with a dull thud. The sound was satisfying. It was final. The door was now held shut not by your presence, not by your vigilance, but by the weight of the wood itself. To open the door, you reversed the process. You lifted one end of the bar out of its bracket, letting the other end drop slightly. Then you lifted the second end, tilting the bar until it was free. You leaned against the wall, or you set it down on the floor, and then you pushed the door open. The entire process took less than a minute, sometimes less than 30 seconds. But it was a deliberate act. It required effort. It required you to be inside the dwelling to perform it. This was the key advantage of the wooden bar. It could only be placed or removed from inside the house. Someone standing outside the door had no way to lift the bar. They could push against the door as hard as they wanted, but unless they could somehow reach through a gap in a wall or climb through a window, the bar would not move. The door would not open. Medieval castles used the system extensively. The enormous doors that sealed the main gate of fortress were often held shut by a bar the size of a small tree. These bars were so heavy that it took 3 or 4 men to lift them into place. They were stored in a special alcove near the gate, and when the signal was given to close the castle for the night, a team of soldiers would haul the bar out, lift it into position, and drop it into the iron brackets that had been forged specifically to hold it. The brackets were massive, sometimes weighing as much as the bar itself, and they were bolted directly into the stone walls on either side of the gate. Once the bar was in place, the castle was sealed. No amount of pounding from the outside would move it, but this system was not limited to castles. It was used in farmhouses, in village homes, in workshops and barns. Anywhere there was a door and a need to keep it closed, there was a wooden bar. The size of the bar varied depending on the size of the door. A small cottage might have a bar no thicker than a man's arm, while a large barn might have a bar the size of a ship's mast. But the principle was always the same. The bar lay across the door, resting in its brackets, and the door stayed shut. At night, the ritual of placing the bar became part of the household routine. After the evening meal, after the fire had been banked low, after the children had been sent to bed, the head of the household would walk to the door, lift the bar, and set it in place. The sound of the bar dropping into the brackets was the sound of the day ending. It was a sound of safety. It was a sound that told everyone in the house that the outside world had been shut out at least until morning. In the morning, the ritual was reversed. The bar was lifted, the door was open, and the day began. The bar was leaned against the wall or set in its storage place, ready to be used again when the sun went down. This routine was repeated every day, every single day, for years, for generations. The bar was placed at night, and it was removed in the morning. There was nothing complicated about it. There was nothing elegant about it. It was simply what you did. It was as automatic as breathing, as natural as closing your eyes when you went to sleep. The bar did not fail unless the brackets failed. If the wood rotted, if the iron rusted, if the stone cracked, then the bar might slip or fall. But as long as the brackets held, the bar held. And as long as the bar held, the door stayed closed. Some bars had additional features. Some had a notch cut into one end, so that they could be lifted with a hook pole, making it easier to place the bar if the person doing it was short or weak. Some had a rope tied to one end, so that the bar could be pulled into position without lifting it entirely. Some had a slot cut through the center, so that a smaller stick could be inserted through the slot and used as a handle. But these were refinements, variations. The basic design remained unchanged. The wooden bar was boring. It was predictable. It was the same every time. And that was precisely why it worked. Knots and pegs. Not every door had brackets for a wooden bar. Not every home was large enough or solid enough or permanent enough to justify cutting slots into the walls. For these doors, for the lighter constructions, for the temporary shelters and the mobile dwellings of people who move with the seasons, there was another solution: rope. Rope was one of the oldest technologies in human history, predating even the use of fire, according to some archaeological estimates. People made rope from whatever fibrous material was available. In Egypt, they used papyrus. In Europe, they used hemp or flax. In tropical regions, they used palm fibers or vines. The process of making rope was simple but time-consuming. You gathered the fibers, you stripped them, you dried them, and then you twisted them together again and again until the individual strands merged into a single cord. A good rope was strong. A good rope could hold weight. A good rope could last for years if it was kept dry. To secure a door with rope, you tied one end of the rope to a peg or a hook on the door itself, and you tied the other end to a corresponding peg on the door frame or the wall. The rope was then pulled tight, and the door was held shut by the tension. This was not as secure as a wooden bar. If someone pulled hard enough from the outside, the rope might stretch or snap. But for most purposes, it was sufficient. The real security of the rope system came not from the strength of the rope itself, but from the knot. Knots were a language, a form of communication that transcended words. Different communities used different knots for different purposes. A knot tied in a certain way might indicate that the dwelling was temporarily abandoned. A knot tied in another way might indicate that the inhabitants were inside and did not wish to be disturbed. Some knots were simple, designed to be untied quickly by anyone who knew the pattern. Other knots were complex, designed to confuse or delay someone who tried to undo them without permission. In ancient China, knots were so important that they were used as a form of early lock. The rope was tied with a series of intricate loops and twists, and only the person who had tied the knot, or someone who had been taught the pattern, could untie it. These knots were sometimes made even more complex by threading the rope through holes drilled in the door or the frame, creating a three-dimensional puzzle that had to be solved in the correct sequence. If you pulled the wrong strand, the knot tightened instead of loosening. If you tried to cut the rope, you would be left with a useless tangle. But for most people, for the farmers and the fishermen and the families who lived in small cottages, the knots were simpler. They were functional rather than artistic. You tied the door shut at night with a basic overhand knot or a simple loop, and you untied it in the morning. The rope hung from its peg during the day, coiled neatly or simply draped across the door. At night, you pulled it tight and tied it again. The act of tying the rope became part of the evening routine. Just like placing the wooden bar. You walked to the door, you took the rope in your hands, and you tied it. The motion was automatic. Your fingers knew the pattern without thinking. You pulled the rope tight, you wrapped it around the peg, you made the knot, and you pulled it tight again. The rope creaked slightly as it took the strain. The door pressed against the frame. And that was it. The door was secured. In the morning, you untied the rope. You unwound it from the peg, you loosened the knot, and you let the rope hang free. The door swung open and the light came in, and then the day began. Pegs were also used as a form of door security, particularly for smaller doors or for interior doors within a larger dwelling. A wooden peg, carved from a branch or shaped from a scrap of hardwood, was inserted through a hole drilled in the door and into a corresponding hole in the frame. The peg acted like a pin, holding the door in place. To open the door, you pulled the peg out. To close it, you pushed the peg back in. The peg was usually carved with a slight taper, so that it fit snugly in a hole but could still be removed without too much effort. Some pegs were left in place permanently, inserted through the door even when it was open, so that they would not be lost. Other pegs were removed entirely and stored somewhere safe to be retrieved when needed. The advantage of the peg system was its simplicity. A peg cost nothing to make. It required no metal, no complex joinery, no specialized tools. Anyone with a knife and a piece of wood could carve a peg in an hour or two, and once it was carved, it could be used for years until the wood wore down or snapped. The disadvantage of the peg system was that it could be defeated easily from the outside if the peg was accessible. If there was a gap in the door or the hole was visible from the outside, someone could simply push the peg out with a stick and open the door. But in most cases, the peg holes were positioned so that they could only be reached from the inside, or they were hidden behind a panel or a piece of cloth, making them difficult to locate unless you already knew where to look. Leather straps were also used in place of rope in some regions. Leather was stronger than most rope and more resistant to weather. It did not rot as quickly when exposed to rain, and it did not fray as easily when subjected to repeated tension. A leather strap tied around a door, and the frame could hold a door shut with the same effectiveness as a rope, and it would last longer. The process of securing the door was the same. You pulled the strap tight, you tied it, and the door stayed closed. But whether it was rope or leather or cord made from woven grass, the principle was always the same. You tied the door shut. You tied it every night, and you untied it every morning. The time became a rhythm, a habit so ingrained that you barely thought about it. Your hands moved on their own, pulling and rapping and knotting, and then the door was secured, and you went about the rest of your evening. And in the morning, you untied it. You pulled the knot apart, you let the rope fall, and you opened the door, and then you started the day. Over and over, night after night, year after year. Early metal locks, rare and boring. For most of human history, locks were not something that ordinary people owned. They were not something that ordinary people ever saw. Locks were rare. Locks were expensive. Locks required metal, and metal required mining and smelting and forging, all which required resources that were beyond the reach of a farmer or a fisherman or a laborer. Locks were for the wealthy. Locks were for palaces and temples, and the homes of merchants who had goods worth protecting. The earliest mechanical locks appeared in ancient Egypt around 4,000 years ago. These locks were made entirely of wood. They were large, cumbersome devices that operated on a simple principle called a pin tumbler. The lock consisted of a wooden bolt that slid through a slot in the door. The bolt had several holes drilled into its upper surface. Above the bolt, inside a wooden housing attached to the door, were a series of wooden pins. When the bolt was slid into the lock position, the pins dropped down into the holes, preventing the bolt from moving. To unlock the door, you needed a key. The key was a large wooden stick, shaped somewhat like a toothbrush, with pegs protruding from one end. The pegs were carved to match the configuration of the pins in the lock. You inserted the key through a hole in the door, lifting the pins out of the bolt's holes, and then you could slide the bolt back to unlock the door. The entire mechanism was crude by modern standards, but it worked. It required knowledge of the correct key shape, and it could not be easily bypassed without damaging the lock. These early wooden locks were used primarily on temple doors and palace storerooms, places where valuable items were kept and where unauthorized access had to be prevented. For everyone else, for the vast majority of the population, such locks were irrelevant. They were too expensive, too complicated, too unnecessary. A wooden bar or a rope was sufficient. The Romans improved on the Egyptian design by introducing metal. Roman locks were made of iron or bronze, and they were much smaller than the wooden Egyptian locks. Roman locksmiths developed the warded lock, which used internal metal obstructions called wards to prevent the wrong key from turning. Only a key with the correct shape, with notches cut in the right places to bypass the wards, could operate the lock. Roman keys were small enough to be worn as rings or carried on belts, which was a significant advancement. For the first time, a key was a portable object, something you could carry with you rather than something you had to store in a specific location. But even these Roman locks were rare. They were owned by wealthy merchants, by government officials, by landowners who had estates and needed to secure their valuables. The average Roman citizen, living in an apartment block in one of the crowded cities of the empire, did not have a lock on their door. They had a wooden plank or a bar, or simply the social expectation that no one would enter uninvited. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the production of metal locks nearly ceased in Europe. The knowledge remained, but the resources did not. The centralized economy that had supported skilled metalworkers collapsed, and the availability of iron decreased. For several centuries, locks became even rarer than they had been before. The few locks that were made during the medieval period were ornate, decorative objects, more art than function. They were commissioned by lords and bishops, and they were installed on the doors of castles and cathedrals, not on the homes of peasants. When a medieval locksmith was hired to create a lock, the process took months. The locksmith had to forge the metal components, file them by hand, assemble the internal mechanism, and test it repeatedly to ensure that it worked. The cost was enormous. A single lock might cost as much as the labor earned in a year. And even then, the lock was not particularly secure. The warded locks of the medieval period could be picked by anyone with a basic understanding of how they worked. The wards were designed to obstruct the wrong key, but a skilled thief could bypass them with a thin piece of metal or by using a skeleton key, a simplified key shape that could operate multiple locks. For the people who lived in villages, who worked in the fields, who raised animals and grew crops and spent their days engaged in manual labor, the existence of locks was barely acknowledged. They heard about them. Perhaps they saw them on the doors of the church or the manor house, but they did not own them. They did not need them. Their doors were secure with bars and ropes and pegs, just as their grandparents' doors had been, and just as their grandchildren's doors would be. The lock was a symbol of wealth, not a tool of everyday life. To own a lock was to own something valuable enough to be worth locking away. And for most people, there was nothing valuable enough. Their possessions were few. Their homes contained a table, a few stools, a cooking pot, some blankets, perhaps a chest for storing grain. None of these things were worth stealing, because everyone had the same things. And even if someone did steal your cooking pot, you would know who did it, because you knew everyone in the village. So the lock remained rare. The lock remained expensive. The lock remained irrelevant to the daily lives of ordinary people. And the doors continued to be secured with wooden bars, with ropes, with pegs, with the same simple methods that had been used for thousands of years. Trust is a lock. In many communities, the most effective lock was not a piece of wood or metal. It was trust. It was a knowledge that everyone in the village knew everyone else, that no one could steal without being seen, and that the social consequences of theft were severe enough to outweigh any potential gain. Villages in medieval Europe were small. A typical village might have 20 or 30 families, perhaps 150 people in total. Everyone knew everyone. You knew which family lived in which house. You knew who was married to whom, who had children, who was widowed, who was sick. You knew who had recently had a good harvest and who was struggling. You knew who could be trusted and who could not. This knowledge was not written down. It was not formalized. It was simply part of life. It was what you absorbed by living in the same place, day after day, year after year. In such a community, theft was rare, not because people were inherently more moral, but because theft was impractical. If you stole something from your neighbor would know it was you. There was no anonymity. There was no way to disappear into a crowd or to escape to another town where no one knew your face. If you were caught, if you were accused, if the community decided that you were guilty, the punishment was swift and public. You might be fined. You might be publicly shamed. In extreme cases, you might be expelled from the village entirely, forced to leave and survive on your own in a world that was dangerous and unforgiving. This social structure meant that doors did not need to be heavily secured. During the day, many doors were left open. Children ran in and out of houses. Neighbors visited each other without knocking. The boundary between public and private was fluid, not rigid. Your home was your home, but it was also part of the village, part of the communal space that everyone shared. At night, the situation changed slightly. Doors were closed, not because of fear of thieves, but because of fear of the dark itself. The night was a different world. Without streetlights, without electric lamps, the darkness was absolute. It was a realm of wild animals, of wolves and bears and foxes that prowled through forests and fields. It was a realm of the unknown, of things that could not be seen but could be heard, moving in the shadows. So doors were closed at night, bars were placed, ropes were tied. But the purpose was not to keep out human intruders. The purpose was to keep out the night, to create a boundary between the warmth and light of the interior and the cold, dark exterior, to reassure the family that they were safe, that nothing could enter while they slept. In some villages, a form of communal watch was organized. This was not a formal system with guards and schedules, but rather an informal arrangement where people took turns staying awake for part of the night, listening for unusual sounds, watching for fires, making sure that nothing went wrong. If someone heard a noise, if they saw a light where there should not be a light, they would investigate. They would knock on the door of the house in question, or they would wake a neighbor, and together they would determine whether there was a problem. Dogs also played a role in the system of trust and vigilance. Nearly every household had a dog, or at least had access to a dog that lived nearby. Dogs barked at unfamiliar sounds. Dogs barked at strangers. If a dog started barking in the middle of the night, people woke up. They listened. They tried to determine what had caused the disturbance. Most of the time, it was nothing. A fox had passed too close to the house. A branch had fallen. The wind had knocked something over. But the barking served as an alert system, a way of knowing that something had changed, that something was happening. Even if that something was ultimately harmless. Geese were also used as alarm animals. Geese are famously loud and territorial. They honk and hiss at anything unfamiliar, and they are difficult to silence. In some villages, geese were allowed to roam freely during the day and were penned near the houses at night. If someone approached in the darkness, the geese would raise an alarm, waking the entire village. This was not a perfect system. Of course, geese also honked at wind and shadows and their own reflections, but it was better than nothing. The trust that held these communities together was reinforced by the church. Religious teachings emphasized the importance of honesty, of respecting your neighbor's property, of living a life that was virtuous and moral. The fear of divine punishment, of being judged in the afterlife, was a powerful deterrent. People believed that God saw everything, that even if you could deceive your neighbors, you could not deceive God. This belief shaped behavior in ways that locks and bars never could. But this system of trust was fragile. It only worked in small, stable communities where everyone knew everyone else. In cities, where the population was larger and more transient, where people came and went and no one knew all their neighbors, trust broke down. Theft became common. Doors needed to be secured more carefully. Locks, which had been rare in the countryside, became more common in urban areas. The anonymity of the city made it possible to steal without being immediately identified, and the density of the population meant that there were more opportunities for theft. In the countryside, however, in the small villages where most people lived, trust remained the most effective lock. You did not need an iron bolt on your door if everyone in the village would notice if you were robbed. You did not need a key if the only people who might enter your house were people you knew, people you trusted, people who had no reason to take anything from you. And so the doors remained lightly secured. A bar at night, a rope tied loosely, a peg inserted through a hole. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would take more than a few seconds to open, because the door was not there to keep out the people. It was there to keep out the cold and the dark and the animals, the people, the neighbors, the community. They were already inside the circle of trust. They were already part of the safety that the door represented. And that trust was enough. It had nighttime habits. The moment when the sun set below the horizon was the moment when the world changed. It was the moment when the door became important. During the day, the door was a convenience, something you opened and closed as you moved in and out of the house. But at night, the door became a boundary, a line that marked the difference between the safety of the interior and the uncertainty of the exterior. The ritual of closing the door for the night followed a predictable pattern. It happened at roughly the same time every evening, shortly after the evening meal. The family would eat together, gathered around the fire or around the table if they had one. After the meal, the dishes would be cleaned and put away. The children would be sent to their sleeping places, which were often nothing more than straw mattresses laid on the floor or wooden platforms built into the walls. The fire would be banked low, not extinguished entirely, but reduced to embers that would smolder through the night, providing a small amount of warmth. And then, before anyone lay down to sleep, someone would walk to the door and secure it. This was not always the same person. In some households, it was the father, the head of the family, who performed this task. In other households, it was the mother or the eldest son, or whoever happened to be closest to the door at the right moment. But the task itself was always the same. The door was pulled shut. The bar was lifted and set in place. The rope was tied. The peg was inserted. The sound of the door being secured was the last sound of the day, the final action before sleep. There was no conversation during this process. No one said, "I am going to lock the door now." No one reminded anyone else that the door needed to be locked. It was simply understood. It was part of the routine as automatic as breathing. You close the door at night. You always close the door at night. And then you went to sleep. The animals, if the family had any, also played a role in the nighttime routine. In many homes, particularly in colder climates, livestock were brought inside at night. Cows, sheep, goats. They were too valuable to leave outside where they might be attacked by wolves or stolen by thieves. So they were herded into the lower level of the house, or into a section of the single room that was partitioned off by a low wall or a woven screen. The animals provided warmth. Their bodies radiated heat, and that heat rose up into the living space, making the cold nights more bearable. The presence of the animals also served as a form of security. Animals were alert to sounds and movements that humans might miss. A cow shifting restlessly in the night, a goat bleating unexpectedly, a dog growling at something unseen. These were signals that something was wrong, that someone or something was nearby. The family slept more soundly knowing that the animals were there, listening, sensing, providing an early warning system that no mechanical device could replicate. Dogs, in particular, were valued for this reason. A dog sleeping near the door was as good as any lock. If someone tried to approach the house, if they tried to push open the door or climb through a window, the dog would wake. And when the dog woke, it would bark. And when it barked, the entire household would wake. And the intruder, if there was an intruder, would flee. Most people who wanted to enter a house uninvited did not want to deal with a barking dog. The noise was too great a risk. It attracted attention. It woke the neighbors. It turned a quiet theft into a public spectacle. So the dog slept near the door, and the family slept knowing that the dog was there. The fire, too, was part of the nighttime routine. After the door was secured, the fire was carefully managed. If the fire went out completely, the house would grow cold, and relighting in the morning would be difficult and time-consuming. So the fire was never fully extinguished. Instead, it was covered with ashes, which slowed the burning and allowed the coals to stay hot through the night. In the morning, the ashes could be brushed aside, and the coals could be rekindled by adding small twigs and blowing gently until flames reappeared. This process of banking the fire was another part of the evening ritual. You poked at the logs, you pushed them closer together, you covered them with ash, and then you stepped back and watched as the flames died down to a soft glow. The light in the room dimmed. The warmth decreased slightly, but did not disappear. And then you went to your sleeping place, and you lay down, and you pulled a blanket over yourself, and you closed your eyes. Sleep came quickly in these times. People worked hard during the day. They woke with the sun and worked until the sun set, and by the time night arrived, they were exhausted. There was no artificial light to extend the day, no lamps bright enough to read by, no distractions that kept them awake. When it was dark, it was time to sleep. So they slept, and in the morning, the routine was reversed. Someone woke first, usually the mother or the eldest child. They walked to the fire, brushed aside the ashes, added wood, and coaxed the flames back to life. They walked to the door, lifted the bar, untied the rope, pulled out the peg, and opened the door. The cold morning air rushed in, sharp and bracing. The light of dawn, pale and gray, filtered into the room. The animals stirred. The day began. And then, that evening, the door would be closed again. The bar would be placed again. The rope would be tied again. The same actions, performed in the same order, with the same quiet efficiency. Night after night, morning after morning, year after year. This was the rhythm of life. This was the pattern that governed the boundary between waking and sleeping, between inside and outside, between the safety of home and the vastness of the world beyond the seasonal differences. The way people secured their doors changed with the seasons. In winter, when the cold was brutal and the nights were long, doors were barred tightly. Every gap was sealed. Every draft was blocked. The goal was not just security, but survival. The cold could kill as surely as any thief, and the door was the first line of defense against it. Winter doors were often reinforced with additional materials. A heavy piece of fabric might be hung over the inside of the door, creating a second layer of insulation. Straw or dried grass might be stuffed in the gaps around the doorframe, blocking the wind that tried to force its way inside. The wooden bar was placed earlier in the evening, sometimes as soon as the sun began to set, and it was not removed until well after dawn, when the air had warmed slightly and it was safe to let the cold rush in. In regions where snow was common, the door itself might be partially buried by drifts. Snow piled up against the outside of the door, creating a natural barrier that actually helped to insulate the house. The snow blocked the wind and trapped air in the gaps, creating a layer of still, cold air that was less brutal than the moving air of the wind. When the inhabitants needed to leave the house, they had to dig through the snow, pushing aside to clear a path. But during the worst storms, they did not leave at all. They stayed inside, behind a closed door, waiting for the weather to improve. The fire burned continuously in winter. It was never allowed to go out, because relighting it would waste precious fuel and time. The door remained closed not just at night, but during the day as well, open only when absolutely necessary. Every time the door was open, heat escaped. The cold air poured in, displacing the warm air that had been so carefully cultivated and maintained. So the door stayed closed, the bar stayed in place, and the family stayed inside, huddled near the fire, waiting for spring. Summer was different. In summer, the door was often left open for most of the day. The goal was no longer to keep warmth in, but to let heat out. The thick stone walls of a house that had been a blessing in winter became a curse in summer, holding the heat and turning the interior into an oven. The only relief was airflow, so the door was opened wide, and if there was a window on the opposite side of the house, that too was opened, creating a cross breeze that carried the hot air out and brought slightly cooler air in at night. Even in summer, the door was usually closed, not because of the cold, but because of insects. Mosquitoes, flies, moths. They were drawn to the light of the fire and the warmth of sleeping bodies. A house left open at night would be filled with insects by morning, making sleep impossible and spreading disease. So the door was closed, or at least partially closed, and a screen or a woven mat was placed over the opening to block the insects, while still allowing some air to pass through. In some hot climates, the door was secured only loosely at night. The wooden bar might be placed across the door, but not lifted into its brackets, simply leaned against the frame to hold the door shut, without sealing it completely. The rope might be tied, but not tightly, leaving enough slack that air could still flow through the gap. The goal was a compromise between security and comfort, between the need to keep the door closed and the need to stay cool enough to sleep. The transition between seasons was marked by changes in how the door was managed. When the first cold nights of autumn arrived, the door that had been left open all summer was suddenly closed and barred. The family noticed a change. They felt it. The closing of the door at sunset was no longer a formality, but a necessity. And when the warm days of spring finally returned, when the air grew mild and the threat of frost passed, the door was opened earlier in the morning and closed later in the evening, until eventually it was left open all day once again. These seasonal rhythms were so deeply ingrained that they required no conscious thought. You knew when to bar the door tightly and when to leave it slightly ajar. You knew when to stuff straw into the gaps and when to remove it. You knew because your parents had known, and their parents before them, and the knowledge had been passed down not through instruction, but through observation. You had watched your mother close the door every winter evening of your childhood, and now you close it the same way, at the same time, for the same reasons. The door was not just a physical object. It was a calendar. It marked the passage of time, the movement of the seasons, the eternal cycle of cold and warmth, of scarcity and abundance, of darkness and light. Window shutters. Windows, when they existed at all, presented their own challenges. For much of human history, most homes did not have windows in the way we think of them today. A window was not a glass-covered opening that let in light while keeping out the cold. Glass was rare and expensive, available only to the very wealthy. For everyone else, a window was simply a hole in the wall, an opening that allowed light and air to enter, but also allowed everything else to enter. Cold, rain, insects, noise, and occasional curious animal. To manage these openings, people used shutters. Shutters were wooden panels that could be closed to seal the window or open to let in light and air. They were hinged on one side, usually with leather straps or simple metal pins, and they swung inward or outward depending on the design of the house. At night, the shutters were closed and fastened with a wooden latch or a peg, creating a solid barrier that blocked the window opening. The process of closing the shutters was part of the evening routine, just like closing the door. You walked from window to window, pulling each shutter closed and securing it. The sound of the shutters closing, the dull thud of wood against wood, was another marker of the day's end. It told you that the house was being sealed, that the outside world was being shut out, that it was time to turn inward and prepare for sleep. In winter, the shutters were closed tightly and often reinforced with additional materials. A piece of oilcloth might be stretched across the inside of the window, creating a barrier that blocked the wind while still allowing some light to filter through. The cloth was not transparent, but it was translucent, and on a bright winter day, it diffused the sunlight into a soft, even glow that illuminated the interior without creating harsh shadows. In summer, the shutters were often left open all night. The goal was to let the cool night air flow through the house, carrying away the heat that had built up during the day. But even when the shutters were open, there was usually some form of screen to keep out the insects. This screen might be a woven mat made from reeds or a piece of loosely woven fabric. It was not perfectly effective. Insects still found their way in, but it reduced the problem enough to make sleep possible. Some houses had multiple sets of shutters for each window. The outer shutters were solid wood, designed to provide security and block the wind. The inner shutters were lighter, sometimes just a framework of wood with cloth or paper stretched across it. In winter, both sets of shutters were closed, creating a double barrier that provided better insulation. In summer, the outer shutters might be left open while the inner shutters were closed, allowing air to flow while still maintaining some privacy. The maintenance of shutters was an ongoing task. Wood exposed to the elements weathered quickly. It cracked and warped and rotted. The leather hinges dried out and tore. The pegs that held the shutters closed wore down and snapped. Repairing shutters was a common chore, something that was done whenever there was time, whenever the weather was good enough to work outside. You replace a broken hinge. You carve a new peg. You plane down the edge of the shutter that had swelled and no longer fit properly in the frame. In cities where houses were built close together and windows faced onto narrow streets or courtyards, shutters also served a social function. Closed shutters signaled that the inhabitants were asleep or did not wish to be disturbed. Open shutters signaled that the house was awake and that visitors were welcome. People learned to read these signals, to know at a glance whether it was appropriate to knock on a door or call out a greeting. But in the countryside, where houses were more isolated, the shutters served mainly a practical purpose. They kept out the cold. They kept out the rain. They kept out the insects. And at night, they kept out the darkness. Closing the shutters was like closing the door. It was an act of separation, a way of drawing a line between the inside and the outside, between the known and the unknown. When the shutters were closed and the bar was in place across the door, the house became a sealed space, a small world unto itself. And in that sealed space, the family was safe. Or at least they felt safe. And that feeling was city gates closing at dusk. In cities, the concept of the door expanded beyond the individual home. The city itself had doors. These were the gates, enormous structures of wood and iron that controlled access to the urban space. The gates were open at dawn and closed at dusk, and when they closed, the city was sealed. No one could enter. No one could leave. The city became, for the duration of the night, an island cut off from the world outside its walls. The closing of the city gates was a public event. It happened at the same time every evening, announced by the ringing of bells or the blowing of horns. When the signals sounded, people hurried to finish their business. Merchants packing up their stalls quickened their pace. Travelers who had been lingering outside the walls rushed to enter before the gates closed. Guards moved into position, ready to push the massive wooden doors shut and slide the bars into place. The gates themselves were engineering marvels. They were built from thick planks of oak or other hardwood, bound together with iron straps. The hinges were enormous, forged from solid iron and bolted deep into the stone walls. Some gates had multiple layers, with an outer gate and an inner portcullis, a heavy grating of iron that could be lowered to provide an additional barrier. The bars that held the gates closed were the size of tree trunks, and it took several men to lift them into position. Once the gates were closed, the city took on a different character. The streets, which had been filled with the noise and movement of commerce during the day, became quiet. People retreated to their homes. The only sounds were the footsteps of the night watch, the guards who patrolled the streets to keep order and watch for fires. The night watch carried lanterns, small pools of light in the vast darkness. They called out to each other as they walked, letting people know that they were there, that the city was being watched, that all was well. For the people inside the city, the closing of the gates was reassuring. It meant that the city was protected, that the walls and the gates were doing their job. It meant that even if your own door was secured only with a simple wooden bar or a rope, you were part of a larger system of security. The city itself was locked. You were inside. The dangers, wherever they might be, were outside. For the people outside the city, the closing of the gates was a problem. If you arrived too late, if you did not reach the gate before the signal sounded, you were left outside for the night. You had to find shelter somewhere else, in one of the villages or farmsteads that surrounded the city, or you had to sleep rough, hoping that nothing would go wrong before dawn. This was not just an inconvenience. It was a genuine danger. The roads outside the city were not patrolled. They were dark and unguarded. Bandits knew that travelers caught outside the walls at night were vulnerable, and they took advantage of that vulnerability. So people learned to manage their time carefully. They learned to arrive at the city well before dusk. They learned to keep track of the position of the sun, to gauge how much daylight remained, to plan their journeys so that they would reach the gate with time to spare. And if they failed, if they miscalculated and found themselves outside the walls as the bells began to ring, they ran. They ran as fast as they could, hoping to reach the gate before it closed, before the bars were slid into place, and the city was sealed for the night. The gates were open again at dawn. The process was the reverse of the closing. The guards removed the bars, pushed the gates open, and the city came back to life. Farmers arrived with carts full of produce. Merchants set up their stalls. Travelers who had spent the night outside filed to the gates, relieved to be inside the walls again. And the cycle began anew. The city gates were, in many ways, the ultimate example of the door as a boundary. They were not just a physical barrier. They were a symbol of order, of control, of the divide between the civilized space of the city and the uncertain space of the countryside. When the gates closed, the city was sealed. When they opened, the city was connected to the world again. And for the thousands of people who lived inside the walls, the knowledge that the gates were closed at night was a source of comfort. It was a large-scale version of the wooden bar across the door, a way of saying, this space is ours. We are safe here. The outside world can wait until monasteries and communal sleeping spaces. In monasteries, convents, and other communal living spaces, the relationship between doors and security was different from that of individual homes. Monks and nuns did not live in separate houses with their own doors. They lived together, sleeping in dormitories, eating in common halls, praying in shared chapels. The door to the monastery was collective. It was not your door. It was everyone's door. Monasteries were usually built with high walls and a single gate. The gate was closed at night, just like the gates of the city, and it was opened in the morning. But inside the walls, the individual rooms and buildings often had no doors at all, or only simple curtains. Privacy was not a priority. In fact, privacy was often discouraged. The monastic ideal emphasized community, shared experience, collective worship. To be alone, to separate oneself from the group, was to risk pride and individualism, which were seen as spiritual dangers. The dormitories where the monks slept were large open rooms with rows of narrow beds. Each monk had a bed, a blanket, and perhaps a small chest for personal belongings. There were no walls between the beds, no partitions, no doors. Everyone slept in the same space. Everyone woke at the same time, usually in the middle of the night, for the first prayer service of the day. The lack of doors was intentional. It reinforced the sense of community, the idea that you were not an individual but part of a collective body dedicated to a common purpose. The door to the dormitory was usually a simple wooden door with a basic latch. It was not locked. There was no need to lock it. The monks had taken vows of poverty. They owned nothing worth stealing. And even if they had owned something valuable, stealing from a fellow monk would have been unthinkable, a violation not just of the rules of the monastery, but of the spiritual principles that governed their lives. The gate to the monastery, however, was a different matter. This door was locked at night, and it was guarded. Monasteries were often wealthy institutions, even if the individual monks were poor. They owned land, they collected tithes. They produced goods such as wine or manuscripts that could be sold. The monastery itself was a target for thieves, and the gate needed to be secured. The monk responsible for the gate, called the porter, had the only key. He opened the gate in the morning and closed it at night. He controlled who entered and who left. He was, in a sense, the lock itself, a human barrier that determined access to the entire community. Inside the monastery, the rhythms of life were dictated by the bells that rang to mark the prayer times. These bells also marked the closing of the gate. When the bell rang for Compline, the final prayer service of the day, everyone knew that the gate would soon be closed. The monks finished their work, returned to the dormitory, and prepared for sleep. The porter walked to the gate, closed it, and slid the bar into place. The sound of the bar dropping into its brackets echoed through the courtyard. And then, silence. Monastic life was structured around routine. Everything happened at the same time every day. You woke at the same time. You prayed at the same times. You ate at the same time. And you closed the gate at the same time. This predictability, this rigid adherence to schedule, was part of the spiritual discipline. It was a way of organizing life so that there were no distractions, no surprises, no deviations from the path of righteousness. The door in this context was not a personal boundary, but a communal one. It marked the edge of the monastery, the line between the sacred space inside and the secular world outside. When the door was closed, the monastery was sealed off from the temptations and distractions of the outside world. The monks were free to focus entirely on their prayers, their work, and their communal life. And in the morning, the door was opened again. The porter unlocked the gate, pushed it wide, and the world rushed back in. Peasants arrived seeking charity. Messengers brought news. Merchants came to buy or sell. The boundary was permeable once more, at least until the evening bell rang and the gate was closed again. This pattern repeated itself every day, year after year, century after century. The gate closed at night. The gate opened in the morning. The monks slept in their communal dormitory, behind a simple, unlatched door, trusting that their poverty and their piety were protection enough. How fear of fire shaped door design. Fire was one of the greatest dangers of pre-modern life. Houses were built from wood and thatch, materials that burned easily. Candles and oil lamps were used for light, and open fires were used for cooking and heating. A single spark could ignite a blaze that would consume an entire house in minutes. And because houses were often built close together, especially in cities, a fire that started in one building could spread to others, destroying entire neighborhoods. This constant threat of fire influenced how doors were designed and how they were used. The door had to be easy to open from the inside, even in the middle of the night, even in a panic. If a fire started, if the flames began to spread, you needed to be able to escape immediately. A door that was too securely fastened, a bar that was too heavy to lift quickly, a lock that required fumbling with a key. These could be death sentences. For this reason, most doors in ordinary homes were secured with simple mechanisms that could be disengaged quickly. The wooden bar could be lifted with a single motion. The rope could be untied in seconds. The peg could be pulled out with one hand. These systems provided enough security to keep out animals and casual intruders, but they did not trap the inhabitants inside. They allowed for rapid escape. In cities where the risk of fire spreading was greatest, there were often regulations about how doors should be constructed and secured. Some cities require that doors open outward rather than inward, so that in the event of fire, a panicked crowd trying to escape would not jam the door shut by pressing against it. Other cities require that doors be wide enough to allow furniture and possessions to be carried out quickly, so that people could save at least some of their belongings before the fire consumed everything. The fear of fire also influenced the placement of doors. Ideally, a house had more than one door, so that if one exit was blocked by flames, there was another way out. These secondary doors were often smaller and less prominent than the main door, positioned at the back or side of the house. They were secured with the same simple mechanisms: a bar, a rope, a peg, and they were kept clear of obstructions so that they could be used in an emergency. At night, when the fire on the hearth was banked low and everyone was asleep, the risk of fire was paradoxically higher. The fire was unattended. If a log shifted and rolled out a hearth, if a spark landed on a piece of clothing or a straw mattress, the flames could spread before anyone woke up. For this reason, some families assigned someone to stay awake for part of the night, not to guard against intruders, but to watch the fire, to make sure it stayed contained, to ensure that nothing went wrong. The door, in this context, was not just a way of keeping danger out. It was also a way of letting safety in. If a fire started, if the alarm was raised, neighbors would come running. They would bring buckets of water. They would help to carry out the furniture. They would work together to extinguish the flames or at least prevent them from spreading. The door had to be openable from the outside as well as from the inside, so that help could arrive quickly. Some houses had fire buckets stored near the door, leather or wooden buckets filled with water and kept ready for emergencies. If a fire broke out, the first action was to grab the buckets and throw the water on the flames. If that was not enough, you ran outside and called for help, and your neighbors came with their buckets, and together you fought the fire. The door, left open during the emergency, became a passageway not just for people but for the water that might save a house. The fear of fire was so pervasive that it shaped not only the physical design of doors, but also the social practices surrounding them. You did not bar your door so securely that you could not hear if a neighbor called for help. You did not lock yourself in so tightly that you could not get out if you needed to. The door was a balance, a compromise between security and accessibility, between keeping danger out and allowing escape when danger arose from within. And more section, the edges of the story. There are other details, other small pieces of the story of how people secure their doors before modern locks. These details are not central to the narrative. They are not dramatic or particularly important, but they exist and they add texture to the picture, and so we will explore them briefly, gently, without hurry. In some cultures, bells were hung on doors or above doorways. These were not alarms in the modern sense. They were simple bells, the kind that rang when the door was open or when someone passed the doorway. The purpose was not to startle or alert, but simply to announce. The sound of the bell told the inhabitants that someone had entered. It told visitors that they had been noticed. It was a soft, unobtrusive form of security, relying on sound rather than physical barriers. In Japan, for example, traditional houses often had sliding doors made of wood and paper. These doors, called shoji or fusuma, were not secured with locks or bars. They were held closed by gravity and friction. You could slide them open with one hand. There was no mechanism to lock them. The security came not from the door itself, but from the social expectations that govern behavior. You did not enter someone's house without permission. You announced yourself. You waited to be invited in. The door was a formality, a mark of the boundary, but it was not a barrier. In other regions, doorways were protected by symbols rather than by physical security. A horseshoe nailed above the door was believed to bring good luck and ward off evil spirits. A sprig of rowan or a bundle of herbs hung from the doorframe served a similar purpose. These were not rational security measures. They were spiritual ones. They worked not by physically preventing entry, but by creating a psychological barrier, a sense that the house was protected by forces beyond the material world. Some cultures carved symbols into the wood of the door itself. These carvings might depict religious figures, protective deities, or abstract patterns believed to have aperture-pay properties. That is, properties that turn away evil. The door became a canvas for these beliefs, a surface on which people inscribed their hopes for safety and their fears of the unknown. In particularly cold climates, where the door was a critical defense against freezing temperatures, some houses had double doors. The outer door was thick and heavy, designed to block the wind. The inner door was lighter, sometimes a little more than a curtain or a wooden frame covered with hide. Between the two doors was a small vestibule, an airlock that trapped the cold air and prevented it from entering the main living space. To enter the house, you opened the outer door, stepped into the vestibule, closed the outer door behind you, and only then opened the inner door. This system reduced heat loss and made the interior of the house more comfortable. The process of passing through these double doors became a small ritual. You did not rush. You did not leave both doors open at once. You moved deliberately, opening one door, closing it, opening the next, closing it. Each step was careful, measured, designed to preserve the warmth that had been so carefully cultivated inside. In cities with strong guild systems, certain doors had special markings that indicated the trade of the occupant. A blacksmith might have an iron horseshoe mounted on his door. A baker might have a carving of wheat. A cobbler might have a wooden shoe. These markings served a practical purpose. They helped people find the services they needed, but they also served a social purpose. They identified the occupant as a member of a particular community, a person with particular skill and status. The door was not just a door. It was an advertisement, an identity marker, a way of saying, this is who I am, this is what I do. There were also regional variations in how doors were oriented. In some cultures, doors faced east to greet the rising sun, which was seen as auspicious. In other cultures, doors faced away from the prevailing wind, which was practical. In still others, doors were positioned according to principles of feng shui or other geomantic beliefs, systems that sought to harmonize the built environment with the natural landscape and the flow of invisible energies. These variations, these small differences in practice and belief, remind us that there was no single way to secure a door. Every culture, every region, every community developed its own methods, shaped by the materials available, by the climate, by the social structure, by the spiritual beliefs that govern daily life. But beneath all these variations, there was a common thread. The door was a boundary. It marked the line between inside and outside. And at night, that line needed to be maintained. However you did it, with a bar or a rope or a bell or a symbol, or simply with trust, the door was closed. The boundary was established. And then the repetition of closing. Let us return now to the action itself. The simple, repetitive action of closing the door at the end of the day. Because this is where the story lives. Not in the grand narratives of history. Not in the dramatic moments of danger and escape. But in the quiet, boring, everyday repetition of a task that had to be done every single night. You walk to the door. The light outside is fading. The sun has set, or is about to set, and the world is turning that particular shade of gray. That means the day is ending. You reach for the door, and you pull it closed. The wood scrapes slightly against the frame. The hinges creak. The door settles into place. You lift the wooden bar. It is heavy. You have lifted it so many times that you no longer think about the weight. Your muscles know exactly how to position themselves, how to grip the wood, how to angle the bar so that it slides easily into the brackets. You lift one end, and you guide it into the first bracket. The wood drops into the slot with a solid thunk. You lift the other end, and you guide it into the second bracket. Another thunk. The bar is in place. The door is secure. Or perhaps you do not use a bar. Perhaps you use a rope. You take the rope in your hands. It is rough, made from hemp or flax, and has been used so many times that it is soft and pliable. You wrap one end around the peg on the door. You pull it across to the peg on the frame. You wrap it around, once, twice. You tie a simple knot. You pull it tight. The rope holds the door closed. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. Or perhaps you use a peg. You take the peg from its place on the shelf or from the hook on the wall. It is smooth, worn down by years of use. You insert it to the hole in the door and into the corresponding hole in the frame, though it slides into place with a soft click. The door is held shut. The peg will stay there until morning. You step back. You look at the door. It is closed. The bar is in place, or the rope is tied, or the peg is inserted. The task is complete. You turn away from the door and return to the interior of the house. The fire is burning low. The family is settling in for the night. The day is ending, and tomorrow night you will do it again. You will walk to the door, and you will close it, and you will secure it in exactly the same way. The same motions, the same sounds, the same feeling of finality as the bar drops into place, or the rope pulls tight, or the peg slides home, night after night. The repetition is comforting. It is predictable. It is boring, but it is also essential. It is a rhythm of life, the pattern that structures a boundary between day and night, between waking and sleeping, between the world outside and the world inside. You do not think about it anymore. You do not marvel at the simplicity of the mechanism or the effectiveness of the design. You simply do it. You close the door. You secure it. And then you go about the business of ending your day. The fire crackles. Someone coughs. A child murmurs in sleep. Outside, the wind picks up and you hear it moving through the trees. But inside, behind the closed door, behind the wooden bar or the tied rope or the inserted peg, you are safe. Or at least you feel safe. And that feeling is enough. The door is closed. The bar is in place. The rope is tied. The peg is inserted. The day is over. And in the morning, you will wake and you will remove the bar or untie the rope or pull out the peg, and you will open the door and the day will begin again. But for now, the door is closed. For now, the outside is outside and the inside is inside, and the boundary between them is maintained by nothing more than a piece of wood and the simple, repetitive action of securing it. This is how people locked their doors before modern locks. This is how they kept the night out and the warmth in. This is how they marked the end of the day and the beginning of sleep. With a bar, with a rope, with a peg, with trust, with habit, with the quiet, boring, essential repetition of a task that had to be done every single night, in every single home, for thousands and thousands of years. The door is closed now. The bar is in place. And nothing else needs to happen. Closing thoughts. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, exploring these quiet, ordinary moments from the past. The story of the door is not a story of excitement or adventure. It is a story of routine, of the small actions that filled the space between waking and sleeping, of the ways that people created safety and comfort in a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. If you enjoyed this journey into the mundane, please consider leaving a like on this video. It helps others find these quiet explorations. And if you would like to hear more stories like this one, stories that are gentle and slow and designed to help you drift away from the noise of the modern world, please subscribe to Dreamy Hours. There are many more stories waiting, many more forgotten corners of history to explore together. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, sometimes the most important things are the ones we repeat without thinking, the small rituals that mark the rhythm of our days and the boundaries of our nights. Good night.